Hello and welcome. I'm thrilled to have you join us today for this first of its kind webinar where we talk about why, when it comes to vitamin D, two sources are best. This Saturday, the 2nd of November, is Vitamin D Day, and today you'll learn about strategies to address deficiency of this important vitamin. My name is Gemma O'Hanlon. I'm a Research and Development Manager at Hort Innovation. Hort Innovation is today's supporter of today's webinar. We are a non-for-profit, grower-owned research and development corporation that represent Australia's horticulture industries. And these include the fruit, vegetable, turf, nursery, flower sectors. Our aim is to drive a prosperous and healthy Australia by providing the best knowledge and solutions to drive a world-class horticulture sector. Today we're supporting the webinar to share an update on lifestyle medicine and vitamin D. So this webinar will go for 60 minutes and we have the pleasure of two speakers with us today. First up, we have GP Dr. Jill Gamberg, who'll be speaking on what is the role of lifestyle medicine in addressing vitamin D deficiency. She will be followed by Dr. Flávia Fayet-Moore, nutrition scientist and dietitian, who will be speaking on a whole foods approach to meeting vitamin D intakes. We will then finish with a Q&A. You can submit your questions anytime during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. When you click on the Q&A window will appear. Type your question and enter submit. If we don't get to your question during the Q&A, we will endeavour to do so after the webinar. Please note that as an attendee, you'll be automatically muted and won't be able to speak. But if you wish to contact us during the webinar, please use the Q&A function to submit your comments and questions. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Jill completed her medical degree with honours from the University of New South Wales, and prior to that she completed a bachelor degree in exercise science and sport therapy. She became a GP after completing her fellowship with the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. Jill is a board-certified lifestyle medicine physician who's passionate about communicating the importance of lifestyle interventions in the prevention and treatment of her patients. I'll now hand over to Jill to get us underway.
I'm a GP and lifestyle medicine physician, and as Gemma kindly said, and today we're going to talk about what the role of lifestyle medicine is in addressing vitamin D deficiency. So first of all, just looking at lifestyle medicine is a very individualized approach, and we just need to understand a little bit more about why lifestyle medicine. So if you look at this type of approach, it's an evidence-based modification of lifestyle behaviors to prevent non-communicable disease and maintain wellness. It's science-based and evidence-based. It's a really patient-centered approach. And if you have a look at this slide in particular, if you look at a study by Eager in 2017, 3 factors such as nutrition, smoking cessation, and exercise can prevent up to 80% of chronic disease. That's huge. So if you just look at the type of chronic diseases we can prevent by altering these lifestyle medicine behaviors, things like obesity, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and many more. So what is lifestyle medicine? Well, lifestyle medicine incorporates all of the categories of behavior as you see on this slide. And, you know, let's break them down a little bit individually. So if we look at regular physical activity, what are we talking about? Well, most guidelines in different countries, including Australia, suggest 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week. So that's only a total of 2.5 to 5 hours in total. And this can be broken down in 10-minute segments. So, you know, it's really doable for most people. If we look at nutrition, really what's recommended is a whole food, plant-rich diet. So things that are processed and packaged are not really as good as whole foods. If we look at sleep, you really want to talk about good quality sleep. The average adult needs about 7 to 9 hours per night to feel rested. So looking at tobacco and alcohol, ultimately most people we would suggest to decrease, but if you want to get the full benefits, cessation is really good. And I think another one that a lot of people don't think about is social connectedness. So humans are inherently social beings. And if, there's studies that show that loneliness is even as bad for us as smoking. And so it's really important to nurture people, to help them to improve their relationships with others, to improve their well-being. And stress is a big one. If you look at GP presentations, a good percentage, maybe even up to 40% in some studies, if you're looking at the beach data specifically, mental health presentations like stress, depression or anxiety, it's huge. So, now we're sort of want to look at why vitamin D in relation to lifestyle factors. So again, if you look at the RACGP guidelines, which is what SGPs are supposed to go by, and in conventional medicine, what we do is we test vitamin D and we look at the levels. So if we see less than 50 nanomoles per liter, we're supposed to screen the population. Just see why is, looking at the factors, why are they deficient? And then if we look at the next level of deficiency, we're talking about mild deficiency. So that's 30 to 49 nanomoles per liter. And the suggestion for that is sun exposure, which is good, but not everybody can get outside. And so then if we look at moderate to severe deficiency, this is less than 30 nanomoles. And the recommendation for ACGP guidelines is supplementation. Okay, so, what I wanted to mention as well is if we're talking about taking those lifestyle factors and putting them into managing vitamin C, as we recommended in the last slide, vitamin D, as we recommended in the last slide, the SGPs are told to pretty much offer supplementation or sun exposure, as I described in those categories. But wouldn't it be better to look at a more lifestyle medicine approach? For example, going outside in the sun for a power walk with a good friend. Daily exposure to sun helps regulate melatonin, and that really helps your circadian rhythm improve, which then helps you get a good quality sleep, makes you more rested, and the next day you might make healthier food choices, and this helps decrease stress. So having a lifestyle medicine approach to addressing those factors is probably a more whole looking at the whole person approach to the simple, more conventional approach, which is just sun exposure and vitamin D supplementation. So let's talk about the established guidelines in terms of what SGPs are supposed to do. So I don't know if you're aware that the guidelines currently are established on bone health only. So those values in the last slide that were 50 nanomoles, et cetera, mild deficiency, severe deficiency, are only based on bone health. If you have a look on the right of the slide, the recent evidence is emerging over the last few years. If you look, these are all reviews on autoimmune disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, cognition, fertility, and the list goes on. These are all studies to do with how vitamin D deficiency is related to these disease processes. And, maybe our guidelines need to be reviewed in terms of maybe 50 nanomole, even though it's saying that that's the baseline for what's considered deficiency, maybe that's not appropriate when it's in relation to those other conditions as described. So clearly more evidence is needed. We need to alter the guidelines. We need to improve them. We need to bring them into today's day and age in 2019. So if we look at diet, we are looking at the recommended dietary intakes. So if you have a look at this slide here, this The dietary recommendations by the nutrient reference values are based on an assumption that there is no sun exposure. So in 0 to 50-year-olds, it's 200 IUs a day from food. In the 50 to 70-year-old bracket, it's 400 IUs. And in the over 70 bracket, it's 600 IUs. You'd be surprised to know that, in fact, Australians, on average, if you look at a study by NAUS, that only most of us get 80 to 120 IUs from diet. And that's mostly from margarine, which is mandatorily fortified in Australia with vitamin D. But clearly, it's well below the targets. And even these targets in total only bring you up to if you adhere to these guidelines, it only brings you up to a total of approximately, like if you eat this much per day, of about 28 nanomoles per liter, which is still way below the 50 nanomole per liter, which is according to the guidelines. So we're not using diet. People are not meeting those targets. Okay, so if we look at if we look at vitamin D deficiency in Australia, about 1 in 4 people, so it's a huge amount of Australians, according to the Australian Health Survey. About 25% of people are vitamin D deficient in Australia. That's huge. And this is even higher in groups. If you have a look again at the Australian Health Survey, or Malakova, if you look at groups specifically like people who are sedentary or people who smoke, the vitamin D levels are lower. If you look at in winter, so it's pretty obvious that in winter, our exposure to sun is less because the sun is out for less amount of hours per day. We are further away from the sun, and our bodies are mostly covered up, for example, with a coat or whatever. So vitamin D deficiency is even increased in the winter. Lower latitude, so for example, people in Queensland get more sun because they're closer to the equator than compared to those in, for example, Tasmania, because we're further away from the equator. So lower latitude is usually more vitamin D deficient. And this one's a bit surprising in that younger age group, in the 18 to 34 group, are more vitamin D deficient. And the theory behind this is that, for example, the older adults are perhaps, who you would assume would be more vitamin D deficient, are perhaps taking supplementation as compared to the younger adults in the 18 to 34 group who are probably working as indoor workers or, staying out of the sun. There are a few studies in the recent evidence. One study that my lovely colleague Flávia ran, and that's specifically in office workers. So if you look at, it's even higher than the 1 in 4. This is going from about 29 to 42% of vitamin D deficiency in office workers. There's a study in African immigrants by Horton and French, where up to 36% of people, and that's because of darker skin color, and people who have darker skin color make less vitamin D for the same amount of time as someone who has lighter skin, because there's more blocker. The melanin blocks in the skin blocks the body's production of vitamin D. So they just need to stay out for longer. And then this is interestingly enough, there's the study by Insering where 51% of chemotherapy patients were vitamin D deficient. And this is because the requirements based on the chemotherapy drugs, which are quite cytotoxic, increases the vitamin D requirements. So therefore leaving them a bit more vitamin D deficient. Okay, so I didn't talk about how the body makes vitamin D by sun exposure. Flávia will go into it more in detail, but essentially when exposed to UV light of 290 to 315 nanomoles, cholecalciferol or vitamin D3 is made by the skin, and that's from sun exposure. And so if we have a look at sun in the summer, no matter where you are in the country, about 5 to 10 minutes of sun exposure following the SunSafe guidelines enables us or most people in the country, to get enough vitamin D in our skin, which equals about 100 IU per day. Where it becomes more difficult is in the winter. So if you have a look at the variability in between Northern Australia, so say in Queensland, Northern Queensland, or Northern Territory, of about 7 minutes, which is equivalent or similar to the summer values, compared to poor old Tasmania, who are way down in the south, who need to stay out for up to 30 minutes. And you know, that isn't maybe doable every day. People would have to spend, some people go to work when it's dark and come home when it's dark. So therefore the only time they could be outside if they're an office worker would be at lunchtime. And that 30 minutes would be the whole lunchtime or a lot of the lunchtime. And it's not necessarily doable. And then people might be wearing a coat. And so you really have to have about 15% of your body, your skin exposed to the sun to make enough vitamin D to hit that 1,000 units. I do think it's important to mention that we need to balance the sun-safe messages compared with the sun exposure. So we're always being mindful of people being at risk of skin cancer or those that are avoiding sun exposure due to skin cancer risk, and how those people maybe, you know, it's always a balancing act of sun exposure versus sun smart messages and avoiding skin cancer risk. So, you know, sun exposure is good and it's necessary and it's our #1 source in Australia, but it may not be practical or safe for everyone. Okay, so this I think is an important thing to think about. I think that it's become very popular, vitamin D, in the last 20 years. And if you have to, and that's good, you know, maybe it means that there's more awareness of vitamin D deficiency, and in helping certainly older people with bone health. But I also think that sometimes it means that a lot of us may be taking supplements unnecessarily. If you look at this study by Belinsky, between 2000 and 2010, there was a 3-fold increase in people taking vitamin D supplements. And then importantly, if you look at this, at the Australian Health Survey, people that are well replete of vitamin D, in fact, those of over 100 nanomoles per liter, were in fact double the rate. So in other words, taking vitamin D very unnecessarily when they're well replete. And so essentially there's a lot of people wasting their money on vitamin D supplementation when they don't need it. And perhaps from a lifestyle point of view, they could be putting this money into other ways of being healthful, like joining a gym or you know, buying more whole foods. So I think it's really important to talk about dietary sources, and that's a big thing in our talk today, because I would say that most people would be unaware of the importance or the importance of diet in vitamin D. If you look at the sources of vitamin D in the diet, this can be by eating oily fish, egg yolk, mushrooms, and fortified foods. As I mentioned before, the only mandatorily fortified food in Australia is margarine. And so I think that, you know, for some people, for most people, it's a very good suggestion to look at dietary intake. And for some people, that will be even more important. So from a GP perspective, what are the pros of recommending diet sources for vitamin D intake? So a whole food approach is an excellent way to eat. Not only are you getting just the vitamin D, but you're also getting all the other nutrients. So for example, if you look at some oily fish, like a salmon, you're not just getting vitamin D, you're getting omega-3s, you're getting protein, you're getting good fats, etc. So, you know, the more than just the vitamin D. There's definitely a lower risk of toxicity when we're talking about having whole foods versus a supplement, and compliance. If people are going to enjoy the foods that we're suggesting, they're much more likely to eat it. You know, if someone loves eggs, they're going to be happy to eat eggs if you suggest they eat eggs. As always, there's cons. So there's very few sources of foods containing vitamin D. Certainly if you're a vegan or vegetarian, the only source which has vitamin D is mushrooms. and eggs, I suppose, if you're just vegetarian. Some vegetarians eat eggs. We need to know more specifically about the effects of cooking and storage. We need to know about access. So, for example, if you live in Middle Australia and out in the outback, and you can only get fish that's been frozen and carried across Australia, it may not be fresh, it may not taste nice, you may not like fish, and also you may not be able to afford it. So you have to be mindful of those sort of difficulties. Food preferences. Not everybody likes fish or mushrooms or eggs. And cooking skills, definitely, if you can't cook or you're not a good cook, you may find that a barrier to cooking these foods. And compliance. Clearly, you're not going to say to someone who absolutely despises fish, you should have fish every day to satisfy your vitamin D needs. Okay, well, what are the take-home messages? The take-home messages are that even in sunny Australia, where sun exposure is abundant, we still have vitamin D deficiency. So I think it's really important to consider lifestyle factors as well. A new study came out in August 2019, so just this year, where when recommending vitamin D replacement, doctors should look at the individual patient as having different requirements, not only a one-size-fits-all model. So looking at things like I mentioned, like does the patient work indoors? Do they exercise? Do they smoke? Do they get outside at all? Are they able to get outside? You know, are they in those at-risk populations, such as in care or residential care, or have a disability, or other at-risk groups? Are they culturally, blocking their skin by wearing clothes that are where you don't have 15% of that body skin available to absorb the sun. So I think it's really important to look at the whole lifestyle of the person and see whether your recommendations are useful for them. I think that we need to relook at our RACGP guidelines as GPs, because currently only sun exposure and supplements are recommended. We need to open that to looking at a diet as well. And diet is totally non-existent in the current guidelines. And certainly my lovely colleague is going to talk much more about this. So I'll turn you back over to Gemma, and thanks very much for today.
Thank you, Jill. That was really interesting. One thing that really struck me from your presentation is just how complex this topic is, and certainly I think as you mentioned, it seems like margarine is currently the source of vitamin D in our food, and I think Flavia is going to go on and talk about how we can source that through whole foods, and particularly when we've got this rise of vegan and plant-based eating, and I think that's important to consider as well as the topic around sun exposure and keeping ourselves in check in terms of reducing our risk of skin cancer. So I would love to now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Flávia Fayet-Moore. So Flávia is the CEO of Nutrition Research Australia, where she leads a team of highly skilled researchers to conduct end-to-end research and communications projects. She's a registered nutritionist, an accredited practicing dietitian, and an honorary associate of the University of Sydney. And she's the first dietitian in Australia to be board certified in lifestyle medicine. So Flávia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gemma, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your day and your busy schedules to come listen to this webinar. We are so excited to share some of the research that we've been working on. I absolutely love micronutrients. It's kind of the reason why I got into nutrition. It's the little things in food that people often forget about, because it's not like a broken arm or a cut where you can't see your body kind of fading from the inside. And vitamin D in particular, I absolutely love, because it's not really a vitamin. Because we can produce it through sun exposure, it acts a lot more like a hormone. And we've got vitamin D receptors in basically every single cell in our body. So beyond bone health and to help increase phosphorus and calcium reabsorption in the intestine, vitamin D does a lot more than probably we think. And not only that, but loving genetics and nutrigenomics, we also have receptors in our genes for vitamin D. So vitamin D can activate, upregulate, downregulate more than 200 different genes in our bodies. So as you can see, I absolutely love vitamin D. And if you haven't figured out yet, what are the two sources that we're talking about today? We're talking about adding diet in addition to the supplement and sun exposure as a strategy to help address this high prevalence of vitamin D deficiency in Australia. So to start off, actually, I was involved in a study. I led it with the University of Sydney, where we looked at the vitamin D status of office workers in Sydney, Australia. We wanted to look at all the different determinants of vitamin D, everything from looking at their skin color, how much of their skin they tend to expose on a daily basis, even how they commute to work. So we wanted to determine maybe if you take public transport, you're walking more and you're getting that sun exposure versus maybe if you're driving to work. We also asked them if they went on a recent summer holiday, because if you go to Fiji in the middle of the Australian winter, you're going to get a lot more vitamin D made than someone who doesn't have that summer holiday. So we looked at all the different determinants that we could think of vitamin D status, even if you're in management, in a senior management, perhaps longer hours, if you take a break and go outside on your lunch break or a coffee break. And also we added diet, because as a dietitian, I wanted to know, can we, crudely measure the effect of diet on vitamin D status of office workers? So what did we find in that study? We obviously found that time spent outdoors was a huge predictor of vitamin D status. And interestingly enough, before we adjusted all the factors in a multiple linear regression to determine which were the predictors, sunscreen use was very highly correlated to vitamin D status. So the reason why sunscreen use was correlated is because people just, if you put sunscreen, you're going outside. So as a GP or a healthcare professional, it's a really nice tip to maybe ask about sunscreen use, because if someone's regularly using sunscreen, it's likely that they're going outside and getting that sun exposure. The next main factor, which is consistent obviously with a lot of the literature on vitamin D, is season. As Jill mentioned, depending on if it's summer or winter, the intensity of the UVB radiation that produces vitamin D in their skin is different. So we found that vitamin D status in winter in the same people that we measured in summer was a lot lower than it was in summer. So as expected, you're not getting that sun exposure. Unlike Canada, which I did my undergrad in nutrition in, there's vitamin D fortification of milk, because no one there gets really sun exposure. In Australia, sun exposure is the main source of vitamin D for most Australians. And that opportunity to have a little bit come from diet, which I'll talk in a bit more detail. So let's look at the other factors. Phototype, which the nurse, when she was doing the blood collection, measured and coded each person, which is based on the Fitzpatrick scale. And we found a really nice U curve. If you were really dark skinned or really light skinned, then your risk was higher and your prevalence of vitamin D deficiency was higher than if you were in the middle, olive type of skin. And that's twofold. It's probably because you have that natural melatonin in the skin if you're dark skinned, and it works like sunscreen. But if you're fair, you're probably either A, avoiding the sun because it will burn you and you go red, or you have a higher skin cancer risk and you're avoiding the sun altogether. But the most surprising finding we found was that in a very crude way of measuring diet, with a yes and no question to fish, we found that fish intake was a really important predictor of winter vitamin D status. So people who reported eating fish were more likely to maintain vitamin D status in winter than those who didn't. In summer, it doesn't really make much of a difference because you get so much from sun exposure. But in winter, when that source is non-existent, diet can play a very important role. So let's have a quick overview of vitamin D metabolism. So as we mentioned, you can get vitamin D from mostly sun, but you can also get from diet and also from supplements. So like I said, it really isn't a vitamin because we can make it. So it's more like a hormone. And we have 7-dehydrocholesterol in our skin that gets converted through UVB radiation into vitamin D3, which then the liver converts into 25-hydroxy-D, which is what we measure. And then as we need it for calcium reabsorption and phosphorus, our kidneys convert it into the active form. We can also get it from diet. So if you eat animal foods that have done that conversion already, you'll get vitamin D3. But we can also get it from non-animal foods, which includes fungi, yeast, and phytoplankton that have ergosterol, which is also a source of vitamin D, which I'll talk about in a second. And of course, there are two different types of supplements. You can get vitamin D2 or D3, and metabolically speaking, they have very similar metabolism, to the point that if you increase vitamin D2 in someone who's replete, vitamin D3 will lower, and vice versa. So they have the same metabolic effect in the body, but the only difference is that vitamin D2 has a lower affinity to the vitamin D binding receptors. So it will leave the body quicker, so you need to have it more frequently. So what are these dietary sources that have vitamin D? As I mentioned, there's animal. So you've got oily fish, and it's oily fish only. It's not any fish. Egg yolks. So we're talking about all foods that have fat, because vitamin D is fat soluble. So you can also get from the fatty skin of a chicken, which often is when you consume it when you have a chicken drumstick. And those of you globally that are probably listening in that don't live in Australia, you'll probably be surprised to know that egg yolks and chicken skin are so high in vitamin D. And again, that's probably because we have quite a lot of free-range chicken in Australia that are getting that sun exposure. We can also get vitamin D from enriched or fortified foods. As Jill mentioned, in Australia, there's the mandatory fortification of oils and spreads, but you can also get it in milk, which I don't believe we currently have any other than formulated beverages that are milk-based. But you can also more recently get it from breakfast cereal as well. So recently, you can add vitamin D to breakfast cereals, which is another potentially vegetarian option. And last but not least, why I'm so excited today and to be here to present some of our research, there's the fungi source of vitamin D. So fungi contain ergosterol, as you saw in the metabolism, that can get converted to vitamin D. And if you're wondering why I have chocolate there, it's not an error. You can actually get vitamin D from chocolate. This is only recently published. It was determined last year. We now have better analytical testing and skills to determine vitamin D, both in serum and in foods. And also because in the process of making chocolate, the cocoa beans are fermented and laid out in the sun for up to 2 weeks to dry. So that sun exposure hitting the ergosterol that's in the fungi produces that vitamin D. And similarly for mushrooms, mushrooms have a lot of ergosterol as well. And with sun exposure, it gets converted into vitamin D2. So how much exactly can we get from our food sources for vitamin D? So here I'm presenting vitamin D equivalents. So that's all the different sources of vitamin D, D2, D3, and so on, that gets converted into that 25-hydroxy-D in our blood levels. So the first is animal. As you can see, predominantly animal sources. I've broken this down based on per serve for you, so you can get an idea for your patients on how much food they have to eat rather than per 100 grams, because it's more comparable. So 100 grams of salmon or mackerel, fatty fish or oily fish gives you about 5.4. If you recall the targets that Jill spoke about 5 micrograms, it's most of the population from birth until 50. But then that triples to 10 and to 15, doubles and triples if you're older. So if you're over 50 or over 70. The chicken drumstick, only if you eat the skin, you'll be getting about 7.4 micrograms per chicken drumstick. Eating 2 eggs will hit nearly that daily intake. So it's a really good source of vitamin D as well. And as you can see, dairy is quite low. It's not really a source that you would be recommending for vitamin D. All the Canadians are probably like, what? So in Canada it is because it's fortified, but in Australia it's not. Then you obviously can get some enriched sources, but still it wouldn't be as much vitamin D in those enriched sources. Then you've got fungi. So chocolate, I've put here 1.6 micrograms per 40 gram, and that's based on that Kuhn 2018 paper that was published last year. But there's a huge variability. It really depends if it's real chocolate made with cocoa butter, because that's where you're going to be getting your vitamin D. But it really depends on how it was produced, right? How long it stayed in the sun, how much fungal contamination the cocoa beans had. So I wouldn't call it a reliable source of vitamin D, especially because it's a discretionary food, even though It does have those flavonoids and antioxidants and some D. It's probably not something you'd recommend as a daily source to your patients. The next one is mushrooms. So in 100 grams, there's about 3.4 micrograms, which is mostly ergosterol if you haven't put them in the sun. So what is the latest science on mushrooms and vitamin D? We're super excited with the team working on mushrooms because we got a grant from Heart Innovation to specifically look at all the science on mushrooms and health. We're looking at Agaricus bisporus specifically, and I'm showing you today the research that the team did as part of the SLR or the review, but also looking in more depth on the science of vitamin D related to mushrooms. So why do mushrooms have vitamin D? I mean, most are animal sources, but that's because mushrooms aren't really an animal. They're not really a plant. They're not really even a vegetable. Maybe we should have a separate recommendation for vegetables altogether. So because it's a fungi and they're unique, they have properties of animals and also properties of plants. So just a really quick fun fact before I move on, if you don't know, that button mushrooms are really just the start of the growth of the fungi. Then if you leave it longer to grow, it becomes flat, and then it becomes portabella or portobello. Then there's also Carmini and Swiss brown, which can be called that interchangeably. But the reason I'm showing you Agaricus bisporus as a category is because it has the highest ergosterol content of any mushroom. And luckily, it's the mushroom that's most widely available for us globally, but also in Australia. So let's have a quick look at the metabolism for vitamin D. As you can see here, this is what's in our skin, 7-dehydrocholesterol. This is what is in fungi or in mushrooms. You're exposed to UV, and through that heat process, there's a conversion into vitamin D3 and vitamin D2. For the nerds like myself in the room that love biochemistry, you can see here that on carbon 22 to 23, there's a double bond, and that's the only difference, and the methyl group on carbon 24 to the sterol that's naturally in our skin. So the conversion is nearly identical. The actual biochemistry of ergosterol is very similar to the sterol that we have in our skin that we can also get from animal sources. And the metabolism in terms of the health effect it has is identical. Like I mentioned before, because of this double bond and methyl group, there's a lower affinity to the vitamin D binding protein. So if you were to supplement with just vitamin D2, you couldn't really do a bolus supplement. You'd have to do it more frequently because it doesn't stay in the body as long as if you were to supplement with vitamin D3 specifically. So recap of the metabolism, all you gotta do is have that UV exposure to ergosterol. It becomes vitamin D2. The liver converts it into 25-hydroxy D2 if it's D2 or D3 if it's D3. So total 25-hydroxy D, which again gets converted into the active form. So how much vitamin D can we get from mushrooms have been exposed in the sun? So 100 grams of button mushrooms, depending if it's cooked or if it's raw. So if it's raw, it's about 2 micrograms. If it's cooked, it's 3 because it loses water. So there's more concentration of it. It produces 24 micrograms per day. That's nearly 1,000 IUs. And just putting your mushrooms in the sun or radiating with UVB radiation, specifically in a lab, will produce basically 1,000 IUs. 24 micrograms, that meets every single population's adequate intake for vitamin D that's recommended through diet. If you look at it comparatively with all the other food sources, it's extremely high. There's really, you'd have to be eating, 300 to 500 grams of salmon per day to reach that target. Fortified foods in high amounts, which most, we want that whole food approach as much as we can. So really your oily fish, eggs, and UV exposed mushrooms are the best sources to recommend if you're going to be recommending a dietary approach. So what does 100 grams look like? Well, we bought the mushrooms and we weighed them and we took photos for you. So it's about 5 to 6 button mushrooms and 6 to 7 Swiss brown, or 1 portobello mushroom, depending on your preference. And I guess, if you're going to be using it as a portobello as a meat replacer, or if you're using it in a pasta, it would be different to maybe chopping up the mushrooms and putting in a bolognese. Looking at it cooked, so that's 2 serves because we often don't cook just for ourselves. So I wanted to show you what about 2 serves of cooked mushrooms look like. So looking at all that science that we have as part of the SLR, we've uncovered some super interesting facts about how can you actually maximize your mushroom's tan. So the gills, which I have mushrooms here, you can see are the inside of the mushroom. So if you put your mushroom like this in the sun, it'll produce a lot less vitamin D than if you just flip it up. So it gills like fish. There's a lot more surface area in there. You'll produce a lot more. However, if you have time, or if you remember to put it out just before you're going to cook it, you can slice it up and put it in the sun, and that'll produce even more vitamin D, because that surface area is the most important predictor of how much vitamin D or ergosterol gets converted into vitamin D2. So what are the other factors that may influence vitamin D content, you're probably wondering? Can I leave it out in the sun all day and come back from work and eat it? Well, you can, but it's not going to maximize your vitamin D. It's a dose response relationship, so it increases basically for every minute that it's out in the sun, up to 1 hour, and then it plateaus. And really, from about 10 minutes, you've got already 1,000 IUs. If you want to increase that even more and more and more, you can leave it a bit longer, but you only really need to put it in the sun for about 10 to 15 minutes, perhaps while you're getting breakfast ready in the morning before you head off to work. The temperature that's optimal, you still produce it in different temperatures. It's a lot lower when it's really cold, but about 20 to 30 degrees is where you get the maximum amount of vitamin D being converted. And obviously latitude, if you live closer to the equator, so if in the north of the Northern Territory or Queensland, or you don't need to put it as much because that UVB radiation is a lot stronger. So in this one paper by Urban, and I recommend, it's a great read if you can access it. It talks about all these different factors that influence vitamin D status in mushrooms. But they left the mushrooms for 15 minutes at 10 a.m. and it was about 18 degrees Celsius at the time. It was in Germany, so the latitude is a lot more north than it is south here in Australia. So it probably, for most of Australia, this would apply, although we don't have enough evidence to say that in Australia. We need more research done in this area, which I believe Glenn Cardwell is working on, hopefully, on that science. With just 15 minutes in that study in Germany, 100 grams of mushrooms made 18 micrograms, so more than 100% of the adequate intake, or just under 1,000 IUs. What are the other factors? So if you buy the mushrooms and you put them in the sun, do you have to eat it right away? No, you don't. You can actually put them in the sun, put it in the fridge, and up to 8 days, vitamin D will be retained. So you can just, whenever you remember putting your mushrooms in the sun, you put them in the sun, and then whenever you're ready to make that meal, you can make it. So and that's basically the shelf life anyway of mushrooms when you buy them fresh. So it will last the whole shelf life of having the mushrooms in the fridge. There's also evidence that if you dry mushrooms, that they still retain vitamin D after being exposed to UV radiation, and up to 18 months of the dried mushroom, it still had 50% of vitamin D. Cooking, which is my favorite, obviously, if you're gonna have this strategy, you have to cook the mushrooms or eat it raw, but you still gotta chop it to eat it. But if you add lemon juice, we don't know if it's the vitamin C or the acidity. Again, more research to be done in this area, but it increases the retention of vitamin D if you're pan frying it. The lower the temperature, the better. But also if you're adding that lemon juice squeeze on the pan, you'll get more vitamin D retained. But also, if you are eating a vegetarian meal that has non-heme iron, so plant sources of iron like beans or spinach, then will also help the absorption of the non-heme iron in your pan. So it's a double strategy for 2 micronutrients that I absolutely love. So the next question that most people are probably asking right now is, okay, great, we put it in the sun, we make lots of vitamin D, it's retained, it will survive my fridge. Does it actually increase vitamin D levels in humans, in people who actually consume it? And it does. There's a meta-analysis done by Cashman a few years ago that showed that if you're vitamin D deficient, having vitamin D2 from mushrooms will increase your levels to the equivalent level of the supplement. And there's also this RCT that's in there that I want to just visually show you, where they basically gave mushroom soup. So as mushroom soup as the control, the mushrooms were not exposed to any UV. Then they gave a supplement with the mushroom soup that didn't have UV exposed mushrooms. And then they gave the UV exposed mushroom soup to participants. And it was just a weekly dose. So it wasn't even daily, for 4 weeks. And as you can see in the control, it actually decreased their vitamin D levels because they weren't getting any vitamin D. Everything was controlled. But supplement and UV mushrooms are nearly identical in how it increases the levels. And as I mentioned, it has the same metabolic action in the body. So it's just as effective as supplements. And as a dietitian, I got super excited seeing this evidence. It's something we've known for many years. It was first discovered in 1994. So it's about time that our guidelines and our recommendations catch up with science. So why would you recommend a dietary approach to meeting vitamin D needs? This doesn't just apply to mushrooms. I'll give you the overview of mushrooms, but it also applies to any other food like the oily fish or the eggs. So there's more to vitamin D than just to the dietary approach or to mushrooms than just vitamin D. There's alpha and beta glucans in mushrooms, which are well known to lower cholesterol, but also it's a type of dietary fiber that might have other effects like feeding the microbiome. There's other bioactive nutrients. The carbohydrate profile is really high in fiber, so it's not very high in energy. It's a low-calorie food that's very nutritious. It's the highest source in our diet of ergothioneine, which is a sulfur-containing amino acid, and it has hundreds of other flavonoids that can work with other components in the diet to protect the body from oxidation and all sorts of metabolic functions. So as part of that SLR that we're doing, we're finding a lot of emerging evidence for Agaricus bisporus beyond vitamin D. We've identified 17 human trials, of which 12 are RCTs, looking at all those different factors and of health effects, so diabetes, weight management, cancer, inflammation, and so on. So when you do recommend, as Jill mentioned, a dietary approach, it's really important to think about all the other factors that influence an individual. So most people aren't cooking for themselves. They have a family, or they potentially are in a nursing home or in a community setting. They might not have the cooking skills to make that food, to cook the fish or the eggs or mushrooms. There's that availability and access issues. So if you don't have access to that fresh food, or if you don't like it, it'd be quite hard to meet the recommendations. But basically, all the research is showing that we need to, because of the sun-safe messages, it's really difficult in winter to meet the sun-safe guidelines and your vitamin D needs. In summer, it's not as much of an issue. So what we're proposing is that perhaps, especially in winter, that's when your intake of the dietary sources really needs to go up to prevent that high level that you got in summer from sun exposure from plummeting. So we've come up with a strategy, a take-home checklist as you're a practitioner that you can use to determine if someone's at risk or not based on all the science that we've presented today. So I'll use myself as an example. You've got the non-modifiable factors, which you should already know from your patient or your client. You already know what season we're in, so we're in spring, summer. You probably already know, you can do it very quickly, your patient's phototype. So in my case, I'm the Fitzpatrick scale phototype 3 or 4, which is more of an olive tone. Yes, I'm an office worker. I don't smoke. I'm not taking vitamin D supplements. I do have sun exposure, and I eat all fish, mushroom, and eggs. So in my case, I've got a 2 ticks for increase. So my risk is probably not too increased, and you'd probably want to probe a little bit more about my working hours and how long I'm inside and how much sun exposure I actually get. And I could say, I surf every day, so I do get in the morning quite a lot of sun exposure, but it's not very strong. But I do put my mushrooms in the sun. I eat oily fish regularly, and I love eggs. So you'd probably say, let's not bother testing this patient, because vitamin D testing is quite expensive and it costs the government a lot of money. So we need to do that lifestyle strategy to identify who's at high risk and who's not. If you have someone in winter with dark phototype, office worker already, you're like, okay, good luck making enough vitamin D from sun exposure. So you'd probably have to supplement in addition to encouraging them from getting it from diet. So what the 2 sources that we're talking about. So if you look at the RACPG guidelines that Jill introduced, we're saying, let's add diet to the mild deficiency as a strategy. Let's add diet as a moderate to severe deficiency, because they'll just top up. We know intake in Australia is quite low anyway, and there's room to move. We know that our diets are really poor. a third of our intake comes from discretionary foods and beverages. So there's huge room to improve our diet. That's basically, if you were to eat 3 meals, a whole meal is not nutritious. So let's encourage that rather than just encouraging supplementation, or rather than just encouraging sun exposure, which for many people, it's actually not possible to be sun safe and maintain your vitamin D levels. So what are the take-home messages? We know that Australians have one of the lowest vitamin D intakes in the world. That's because we rely on sun exposure and we don't have a lot of food fortification, but we are also not consuming the most nutritious diets. We know that there are very few sources that can actually meet your vitamin D targets. Most are animal sources. So having the fortified foods and the mushrooms, it's a vegan or vegetarian source that we can add. And sun-exposed mushrooms are really the top source. You could see there's nothing really that compares, and it's as effective as a supplement. So let's include that for those who like eating it as a strategy. So to get your vitamin D, really, I would recommend to tan your mushrooms when you can't tan your skin. And I'd like to thank my team. This wasn't a one-person job. We had a huge team of researchers behind to do the huge SLR that we did and pull together all this information into some practical messages that you can take home with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Flavia, for that. That was a fascinating presentation. I must say I learned a lot, and I was writing so many notes, and we've been inundated with so many questions from the audience as well. So we've got 8 minutes, so we'll try to answer as many as we can. I have one first up question for you, Flavia. I love the fact you mentioned chocolate is a food that we could eat, could get vitamin D from, and I'm sure the media would grab onto that as a headline. But just to reiterate, could you just share, I guess, overall, what would you say is the best food that we can get vitamin D from, and is chocolate an option?
So I guess the best food, or the food that has the highest amount, is the UV exposed mushrooms. But the best food is the food that you'll eat. So that's why there's a lifestyle medicine approach is so important. It's the individual. What are you willing to do in your diet to change? If you love salmon, mackerel, fatty fish, great. Like that's probably the best food for you. But however, talking about the chocolate and some of the other sources, so the top 3 I would say would be fish, eggs, and UV exposed mushrooms. If you can't eat those, the amount of the contribution of the other foods to diet are probably going to be minimal. Obviously, every little bit counts, but because it's so low in the other foods, it's not something that you'd want to actively be recommending. But again, little bits count. So if someone does have a little bit of chocolate and a little bit of chicken skin and a little bit of margarine and a bit of fish and a bit of UV mushrooms and so on, it adds up, right? So it's really from a healthcare professional's perspective, we need to assess the individual for what we think they can achieve, but also for them to tell us what are they actually going to do and maintain for the rest of their life. And I guess with a focus in winter, because that's where it's the most effective. And
I love that message around let's eat more mushrooms in winter. Especially because mushrooms are so versatile at winter time, adding them to stews and soups and all those really comfort foods. And also as you know, a lot of people are turning to other options other than, high meat diets. So I think, we can really embrace mushrooms, particularly at those times of the year, and also to get our vitamin D. And I also loved your message around having the gills up. And I think I'm certainly going to go home and turn my gills up and give my mushrooms some vitamin D. And it's a great way to do that without, having sunburn for yourself. So Jill, one question that was asked, which you might be able to answer, does the 15% of the body exposure, does that relate to sort of your arms or your legs and arms, or how do you get that 15%?
Well, for most people, it just needs to be the equivalent surface area of 15% of your body. So for most people, that would be your face, because that's usually uncovered. And then it could be your arms and legs, or it could be your neck or your back. But essentially just probably 15% for most people is face, arms, and neck. In the winter, again, it's harder to do that because a lot of people are wearing coats or scarves or hats. And so the 15% can be more tricky depending on time of year, cultural background, depending on what you wear. So, you know, that 15% is easier for some and less easy for others.
Thank you. Now, a question was asked around clarified butter. Flavia or Jill, you might be able to answer this. Does that have any vitamin D in it?
So yes, it should still retain the vitamin D. It just depends, I guess, on the temperature that the butter is being clarified. You'd probably lose a bit of vitamin D, but vitamin D is in the fat. So the fat's still there. So you'll definitely still be a source of vitamin D.
And
although it's very low.
When you mentioned to pan fry your mushrooms, for example, would that be a reason why you might absorb a bit more vitamin D is through the fat that, you know, the healthy oil potentially that you're cooking with?
Exactly, 100%. So if you add, for example, extra virgin olive oil to the pan, the flavonoids in the antioxidants in the extra virgin olive oil, as well as the fat, will help absorb the antioxidants in the flavonoids in the mushrooms, as well as the vitamin D. So that's why the whole food approach is so important, right? Because everything, if you supplement someone, that you're basically ignoring everything else that is happening to that person that they would usually get vitamin D from. If it's fish, you're ignoring the omega-3s, the selenium, the zinc. If it's sun exposure, you're ignoring the fact that like sun makes you happy. You get sunshine. You know, if you're stuck in a dark room for a week, you get pretty depressed. So there's all those other factors that with all the science on health effects for vitamin D deficiency that are probably related that we can't measure. It's a confounding factor in all of the epidemiological studies because we can't exclude everything that happens with a lifestyle strategy of addressing vitamin D. Whereas if you just do the pill, which a supplement by far is really important for many people, and it is a strategy we need, but I think let's have two sources where we can, because you get all that other lifestyle benefit from a lifestyle approach to meeting vitamin D.
I love the lifestyle approach, and I love where you also said that the bioavailability is just as high as a supplement.
Exactly.
And
it's just beautiful that you know, when you look at the evidence, and that's even from a meta-analysis, and it's really important when you're deficient. So if you're adequate, it really doesn't make much of a difference in increasing your levels, because if you're adequate, you're adequate. But if you're deficient, then it's the supplement or the UV mushrooms are just as effective. And similarly to like fortified orange juice or any other fortified food will also increase your vitamin D status.
And I also loved how you mentioned that when you add lemon juice, you know, it not only benefits your absorption of vitamin D, but also other nutrients as well. And that goes back to the whole foods approach about how we get so many different micronutrients from our foods. There was a question about how many mushrooms should we be eating every week?
So do you want to answer that, Jill? Are you happy if I do?
Go ahead.
So basically depends on your requirement, right? So depends what your target recommended intake is by your age group and so on. But as a general levels, about 5 button mushrooms exposed to UV for about 10 to 15 minutes makes 1,000 IU. And 1,000 IU is well and above, which is 24 micrograms, any of the adequate intake targets that we have. So about 5 a day, but you can clump it if you just love mushrooms and you want to have it like 4 times in one day. You can do that as well and just have it once a week. Your 7 serves, so 35 button mushrooms.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Flavia. Thank you, Dr. Jill, as well. We've had so many questions that we can't get to right now, but we will certainly respond to those questions following the webinar, and we also will ensure that everyone receives a copy of the webinar today, because I know myself there was so much to take in, and even after writing notes, I'm just thinking about ways that I can get into the kitchen and enjoy, you know, a whole food diet and as a way of getting my vitamin D. So just to close off, if you do have any further questions, Flavia is available to answer them as well. So you can email her at info@nraus.com. And as I mentioned, everyone will receive the link to the recording. You'll also receive a post-evaluation survey, and we'd really encourage you to share your feedback with us on today's session. And also, don't forget, there is a really great website available, australianmushrooms.com.au, with some lovely inspiration and ideas on there. So get in the kitchen and enjoy those mushrooms. So thank you again, Dr. Jill and Dr. Flavia, for joining us today and sharing these insights. And thank you to our audience here for spending your lunch break with us today. We hope you enjoyed this session, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.